First thing, one and a one.
First thing, it's springtime. I'm wearing shorts. I have my day, sunny like my shirt, sunny like the day out. It's my birthday.
Is there any?
Oh, happy birthday.
It's springtime. It's Distinguished Speaker Series time, and we've got a lot going on today. So thank you all for coming. May 4th, I want you to keep in mind we're having a youth involvement fair, and that's going to be at the Orvine Carpenter Community Center. It's going to be $3,000 in free prizes for your grandchildren or kids. So we just please keep that in mind. Try and get the kids there. We're going to have, it's like a job fair, but it's a youth involvement fair. So we have all these different groups that cater to youth and productive and meaningful experiences like junior lifeguard, real guppies, 26 oars, sea cadets, many, many others. So just keep that in mind. We'll be very much appreciative of that. John Sharkey's here. He's retired. He's our longest serving city councilman in Fort Hueneme. Now he's our videographer. Second longest. Yeah.
Second longest.
Okay, so I'm Stephen Gama, volunteer here at the museum, and today I get to introduce to you the assistant curator, Dylan Peterson, from the Carriage and Western Arts Museum. Today, he's going to talk about the history and pageantry of the Dixie Thompson saddle. Now, who's Dixie Thompson? Thank you. I don't know, I can't even get his name right, but this guy was, among other things, the biggest lima bean farmer in California. He was also, it was said, California's most colorful citizen. And he apparently had an affinity for saddles. And is this one of his?
No, but this is made by the same
Okay.
fellow that made his saddle.
Right, then there's a story on that, he's going to get into that. But our speaker, Dylan, in his other life, he is, listen to this, he's an academic curator for the upper division undergraduate laboratories in the molecular, cellular, and developmental biology department at the University of Santa Barbara. Correct? Whoa, so what does that mean?
Yeah, this big.
Let me tell you what it means. He's published multiple research papers on Alzheimer's disease. So now we have a resource. Right? You know, we might have to run some questions down the road. But anyways, thank you very much for coming to the
My
city.
pleasure. My pleasure.
Fort Hueneme, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you all for inviting me. I'm very, very happy to be here. Again, my name is Dylan Peterson. I'm the assistant curator at the Carriage and Western Art Museum of Santa Barbara. I'll go a little bit deeper into my history. I was born in Santa Barbara, went to Santa Barbara High School, went to City College, and then transferred to the University of California at Santa Barbara. I got my degree in biochemistry and then got a master's degree also in biochemistry, and spent about the last 15 years of my life researching Alzheimer's disease, working on the molecular mechanisms of how the disease progresses, and our main goal is to stop it from progressing any farther, which in itself is a quite daunting task. So again, I've only been working with the Carriage Museum for about 8 months. My brother and my father and I go to lunch every week, and we have been for the last 20 years. And jokingly, my brother asked when I was going to take over for my dad at the museum. We all laughed it off, but I started thinking about it. I'm a collector at heart. I love collecting memorabilia, books, all kinds of things. And so the museum was almost a perfect fit for me. And so after a few months of thinking about it, I asked my dad if he wanted my help at the museum, and he was overjoyed. And that was June of last year, and I've got a ton of work shoveled onto me because if you work for free, you can get a lot of work. So, as I said, I've been volunteering with them for about 8 months, and my dad asked me to come down here and give a talk to you guys about Dixie Thompson, his saddle, and what his life was like. Dixie Thompson was born 193 years ago, and it's amazing that we're still talking about him today. And so I'm going to go through basically his life in a kind of chronological sense, and highlighting his work with the Arlington Hotel and the saddle, and all the pageants that he paraded in with his saddle. So without further ado, we'll get right into it. Like I said, Dixie Thompson was born 193 years ago. That was April 8th. In 1826. He was born to John and Mary Thompson in Thompson, Maine. And John and Mary Thompson lived on the Thompson ranch for all their life. He was a fantastic neighbor and a well-educated man. John Thompson married Mary Mustard in 1824, and they had the one child, Dixie. They eventually ended up moving to Oakland, California to live out their lives. John Thompson had many famous brothers. One was Alphys Thompson, and he came to Santa Barbara in the early 1830s, married Francesca Carrillo of the esteemed Carrillo family, and inherited a good portion of Santa Rosa Island. They also built the first two-story adobe building at 807 State Street. It was made of adobe brick and wood, the first of its kind in the Monterey style. It was operated as a hotel, the St. Charles Hotel, but was eventually demolished in 1923. Dixie Thompson was his family had a rich seafaring traditions, and at the age of 20, Dixie became a cabin boy on the ship Richmond, which was captained by his uncle, Captain Mustard, Mary's brother. Dixie traveled to and from Europe over a 2-year period, delivering cotton to Liverpool, Hamburg, and other such ports in Europe. After only 2 years, 1848, Dixie became captain of his own ship, and that's a testament of Dixie's competency. He commanded the ship Savannah, which was one of the finest ships to ever sail the Kennebec River of Maine. Only a year after Captain Thompson became Captain Thompson, he was bit by the gold bug in 1849, which I assume nobody was immune to. So Dixie was headed west. But to get west, you had to travel down the east coast to Panama, and you had to cross over Panama to get to the west coast, but there was no canal yet made. That was completed in 1914. So in 1849, you actually had to travel through the Isthmus of Darien by foot, by horse, and he actually was on a boat for 3 days propelled by natives down the Chagres River. And eventually making his way to the west coast of Panama, you needed to get north to San Francisco to begin finding gold. And the only way to do that was to jump on, or to find a seat on the Pacific Mail Steamship Company to take you up the coast. Times were really hard, and you had to be quite resourceful to be able to get a ride on one of these steamships north. Dixie, being an extremely resourceful individual, he found that there was only a 3-month wait for a seat on a ship, and it cost an unheard of hundreds of dollars in the 1849. Luckily, the Pacific Steamship Company was a very large company. They had many, many captains, and Dixie Thompson's family, being a rich seafaring family, one of his uncles actually was the captain of a steamship called the Falcon. And so Dixie was able to arrange work for travel on the Falcon. So Dixie heading north on the Falcon. Oops, wrong way. He was headed north to San Francisco to try to find a fortune in gold. And in 1849, he plowed into the San Francisco Bay on the steamship Falcon. He remained in San Francisco for about 6 months until mid-1850, or July 1850, when he met a few other fellow Mainers, and they decided to make their way over to Marysville to try to hit the mother lode. He mined for about 6 months, and you can imagine these were hard times in the 1850s. And after 6 months not finding any gold, he was completely dismayed and broke. So he decided to change gears, and at the age of 24, he set off to the Washington Territory north. I keep pressing up, let's press down. So mid-1851, Dixie made his way over to Fort Vancouver in the Washington Territory, and he began building barracks out of log barracks for soldiers at $8 a day.
What was the appeal to go to Washington?
I'm not sure. I wasn't able to find out anything about that. All I know is he didn't find any gold, and I think he just got really frustrated. And heading north, there was Fort Vancouver, and they had a lot of steamships coming out of there. So I think he thought, I could jump back onto a steamship, maybe make some money. Got up there, had an opportunity to be a carpenter, And I'm assuming $8 a day in 1850 was probably a pretty good wage. And I don't know if I believe it, but that's what's written. So in Fort Vancouver, he worked for a few years, commanding multiple schooners and steamliners, some being the Independence, the William Robinson, and the Ohio, and eventually saving up enough money to purchase a ship of his own, which was called the Sophia. And after he was able to acquire his ship, he made his way down to Santa Barbara, ending up at the Santa Rosa Island. Interestingly, as I was doing research, there is a ship that was christened the Dixie Thompson in about 1865. It's the same spelling. I don't know if it has anything to do with him. It may, but I thought that was kind of interesting. Yeah, probably. So Santa Rosa Island, he worked on Santa Rosa Island from 1853 to 1857. He had contacted his uncle Alphas, who I mentioned earlier, and was a partial owner of the Santa Rosa Island due to his marriage to Francesca Carrillo. And he also had a large investment stake on all the cattle and livestock that was on the island. And so Dixie's job was to bring those cattle over to the mainland. The cattle themselves had grown quite wild up in Santa Rosa Island, and there was many sheep, many cattle. He had to actually capture and herd them himself. The males he castrated and disarmed, meaning he would take the horns off these animals to get them on the schooners to make them less dangerous for the transport across the channel. And they say that Dixie Thompson transported approximately 3,000 head of livestock over that 4-year period. And his main goal was to save up enough money to buy a piece of property of his own. So after...
Whose cattle was he collecting?
It was the Moore brothers, and like I said, a lot of it had grown wild and very dangerous out there, so I think they brought some cattle over and they just started multiplying on their own, and his uncle, being a partial owner, saw money there. So, Dixie, why don't you bring him over to the mainland? And he did.
What kind of water source did the cattle have on the island?
I'm not sure. I've never been to the island, so I'm not sure if there was like a freshwater spring or something coming out of there, but it had to be something. Yeah, because that's a lot of cattle. Is that right? Yeah, so that's a great question. I'm not 100% sure. So, after 4 years of transporting livestock, he had earned up enough money to purchase a portion of land here in Ventura County, at the time known as San Buenaventura. So he paid Felipe Lorenzana $1,000 in gold for a portion of Rancho San Miguel, which is on the border between Ventura and Santa Barbara, with the Pacific Ocean being the southern border, and Thompson Boulevard here is actually named after Dixie Thompson, and that was the southern border of his ranch. That's a neat little piece of information. So eventually he was able to acquire almost 2,300 acres. I've heard low as 2,000 all the way up to 4,000 acres. I kind of want to say it's more around the 2,500 acre, which is approximately about 4 square miles. So that's a pretty good portion of land. And let's see. The Thompson Ranch itself was a self-sustaining ranch. They supplied the whole town of Ventura with milk. He stored the milk in what was called a milk house. It was a stone floor, and it had a flow of water coming from the wells to keep the milk wholesome and fresh. And let's see. The ranch also contained its own harness shop, its own blacksmith shop. They made their own wagons, and it was, like I said, a self-sustaining ranch. On the ranch, he employed 60 individuals constantly. He had over 100 head of horse. He had 11 6-horse plow teams to help harvest lima beans. This was the largest lima bean farm in the world at the time. And they say that during harvest time, he would employ about 100 other individuals. They would come up, they would harvest beans in what was called thrashing at the time. And they were making approximately 2,500 bags per day on the ranch. So you can imagine the flow of people and work that was going through there. Mr. James Sweet was the manager of the Thompson Ranch at the time, and he was a very intelligent and well-experienced farmer. And in a year that was promised to be extremely dry and unlikely to be able to yield a bean crop, he decided that they would plant barley for that year. And if the barley didn't flourish as he thought, they could use it for food for the cattle or something like that. But he thought, being the intelligent farmer that he was, he knew if he planted the seeds deeper in the soil, they would be able to get more moisture. And so he did that. He planted the seeds about 6 inches into the ground, and barley exploded. They were able to harvest hundreds and hundreds of bags of barley that year, which saved the ranch. They shipped it all east, and this is in the mid-1960s, early 1960s, so I'm assuming it had a lot to do with the Civil War at the time. But I found nothing mentioned about that.
Do you know the makeup of the crew? Like, was it all whites? Or they had
I don't know. I'm assuming a lot of them are Hispanic,
Chinese?
but I don't really know offhand. It's hard to find information on the ranch. I thought there would be more about the ranch because of how big it was and how important it was, but I was unable to find any.
Just one other question.
Yeah.
We're talking about the ship, and they were shipping cotton over?
Yeah.
For 10 years he did that?
2 years he did that.
Oh, just
yeah.
2. You don't know, they weren't involved in the slave trade, were they? Did they just go back and forth?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, it was
Okay.
at that time.
Okay,
I wouldn't
yeah.
be surprised.
Okay.
And again, there's
Yeah.
just not a ton of information
Yeah,
about it.
okay.
But that's an interesting thought. And crossing the channel at that time was
even
quite a
that.
feat.
Yeah.
And I don't know how long it took, but I'm sure it was quite a hardship just to get over
I'm sure
there.
they had a lot of accidents.
Yeah, I think the first crossing was in the early 1820s, late 1820s, to get over from America to the Liverpool and such places like that.
Why did they decide to plant lima beans and barley?
I'm not sure.
Other
The dry crop.
Is it a dry crop? Is that what it is? I don't know a ton about the lima bean history, but I know Ventura was a big lima bean producer at the time, and I'm not sure if they still are. It was kind of opportunistic crop, I would assume.
I see.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. So the success that he reaped on San Buenaventura Ranch allowed him to save up quite a bit of money. And he was able to purchase land in Santa Barbara. And one piece of property in Santa Barbara was a 227-acre ranch called Ontario Ranch. It was right in the heart of Santa Barbara. It was bound by Alomar Street, which was called Thompson Street at the time. And Ontario, of course, Foothill, and De La Vina. If any of you are familiar with Santa Barbara, it's smack right in the middle of where everything happens. And to be able to own a piece of property right there today would be unheard of. But one more thing about the Rancho San Miguel was in the 1880s he was offered over $500,000 for that piece of property, and he refused. And so I thought that was an exorbitant amount of money for the time.
But wasn't his wife Carrillo though? Didn't they?
No,
all
it was
have
his
something?
uncle. His
His
uncle
uncle-
Alphys.
Oh, so they
They
owned
were.
all the rest of the land.
Yeah, they had a ton of land.
I see.
But Dixie ran the Ontario Ranch in the same fashion. He ran the Rancho San Miguel, having a blacksmith shop on hand and a harness shop. They harvested beans up there as well as walnuts. And he, let's see, what else we got here? And he had 2 large barns that were on the property. They were big white barns at the juncture of State Street and De La Vina. And those barns he used to store all his crops when he was harvesting. And when they weren't in use, he let people store their wagons there. He also let people sleep there a lot when it was too cold to sleep outside, which was pretty common in the 1860s, I'm assuming, 1870s. A lot of homeless also lived there, and after a while they had constables to patrol the area with their torches, and they burned people out. But the barns, like I said, they were quite the landmark at the time. But people coming from Goleta to Santa Barbara to sell their crops at market would stop at the barns as a watering hole. And often they would even hold market at those barns. Like I said, it was a popular watering place. And, he had also built many false fronted buildings. I think he was just a really interesting guy and I don't know if he had a lot of time on his hands, but he was very passionate about what he did. And like I said, he built a lot of these false fronted buildings. I have a picture, it's hard to see a little bit here, but This is at the Carriage Museum. We ourselves have built a whole row of false-fronted buildings that gives it a really nice Western kind of feel to it. But those buildings, those false front buildings, stood for many years after his passing. And the Flying A Studios used him in a lot of Western movies from 1913 to 1921. I looked through a lot of Flying A pictures. I was unable to find any of the false fronted buildings, but I'm sure they're out there if they were in a movie. So I still have lots of research to do.
What's the story with that barn there?
Oh, that's just an interesting picture. I couldn't find any pictures of 1880s barns, so I just wanted to give a nice representation of what it could have possibly looked like back in 1880. So in 1873, Dixie traveled back to Maine, and he married Nancy Sweet, which was the sister of his ranch manager, James Sweet. They came back to Santa Barbara, and he purchased a house on Chapala Street at 1415 Chapala. That house still stands there today. I went and took a picture of it about a couple weeks ago, so y'all can see. They lived there until his passing, which was in 1903. Nancy lived there until 1926 when she passed.
How old is it, that house?
I'm not sure. He bought it in 1874, so it was built well before then. But yeah, it's a pretty cool house. When I went up there, it's kind of one of these, you walk up the stairs, and now it's turned into 4 different apartment buildings. Whether it had the same internal construction at the time, I'm not sure. But you can tell it's quite old when you go up to it. So shortly after returning to Santa Barbara, Dixie would become one of the most well-known and beloved citizens of the town. And he would come to own several pieces of property in Santa Barbara. One of those pieces was a portion of State Street between Ortega and Coda on the mountainside. He owned half a block there. And the area around Ortega Street in the 1880s was a place he wanted to be and be seen. It was a very, very popular place. But soon the center point of Santa Barbara would shift up to the Arlington Hotel. And Colonel W.W. Hollister, which I'm sure most of you have heard the name Hollister before, would engage in a large venture, and that would be financing and building a hotel of great splendor. And it would be called the Arlington Hotel, which would be named after Robert E. Lee's house in Virginia, or home in Virginia.
Where was that located? Is that an actual photo?
Yeah, that's the Arlington Hotel in the 1870s.
Wow, where exactly would that be, on the beachfront?
No, this is State Street right here.
Is that where the Arlington Theater is?
The Arlington Theater is in the same place today.
So are those buildings still there?
Those buildings have been destroyed. The first iteration was burned down in 1909. They rebuilt the hotel. It was destroyed in the earthquake at Santa Barbara in 1826.
So whatever they replaced it with, they put a bell tower, I believe, right?
Yeah, there's that tower is still in the same place, but it looks a lot different now. It's more of a spire type tower. I think it was originally a water tower when the second iteration was made. Hollister was a highly motivated individual and quickly got into the Americanization of sleepy Santa Barbara. His contributions to the city were many, and his efforts changed Santa Barbara forever. He built Santa Barbara College on State and Anapamu. He also built a boarding school for kindergarten through high school, which would eventually become the Elwood Hotel. He built the first steam laundry. He donated 500 books to make the first free library in Santa Barbara. He also purchased the local newspaper, loaned money to John Stearns to build a wharf, financed the Libero Theater, and of course took on the building of the Arlington. He was also the first president of the First National Gold Bank. Yeah, so he was quite the individual. I'm sure most of you have heard of Hollister Ranch and Hollister Street. All this belonged to him. He was married to a woman named Annie, who Glen Annie Road is named after. And Hollister established a joint stock company to finance the Arlington Hotel, with Hollister being of controlling interest. Among the holders were Mortimer Cook, John Hugh, Dixie Thompson. They were financiers of W.H. Stanwood and Reverend Jesse Ho. The Arlington took a year to construct and 6 months to furnish.
Did it just mean does this polisher look like Abe Lincoln?
He looks exactly like Abe Lincoln. Remarkably, I want to know if maybe that's a wrong picture. But yeah, he does look like Abe Lincoln. My dad loves the picture previous. He just cracks up every time he sees him with his chest hair coming out. It's right there. But yeah.
Do you know how Hollister made his money? Does it?
He brought sheep over from Ohio originally. He started out with, I think, 5,000 head of sheep. When he was here in Santa Barbara, he noticed the sheep were eating these dry brambles and all this weeds that not normal animals would eat. And he thought, oh man, this is fantastic. He had, I can't remember what the type of sheep was, but it was a very nice coated sheep where the wool was just excellent. And he and his family actually took carriages and shuttled these sheep over from Ohio all the way to Santa Barbara. And I think he started out with 5,000 head of sheep, and when he got here, he only had about 1,000 left. But still, he was successful in bringing them over.
And what year was that?
Gosh, that had to be in the 1830s, I would think.
And he came from where?
From Ohio. And yeah, there's stories of him being attacked by Indians, and many people died of starvation and dehydration on the way over. And I can't even imagine having to go under something like that at the time.
Do you know whereabouts in Ohio?
I'm not sure offhand. Yeah, that's well known for sure. Remarkable. So as I said, the Arlington took a year to construct, 6 months to furnish. The doors opened February 27th of 1876. The hotel was built on the 91st block of State Street between Sola and Victoria. And today the third iteration of the Arlington still stands today, and it's known as the Arlington Theater. And as I mentioned, the first building was destroyed by fire in 1909, rebuilt, and then again it was shook to the ground by the earthquake of 1926 in Santa Barbara. The site was chosen was fairly obscure, and it was chosen based on a paragraph in a book by Charles Nordhoff. The book was called California, a Book for Travelers and Settlers. And there was a chapter in there called Southern California for Invalids. And Nordhoff writes that there's a good hotel and another being built, but neither of them stand in a pleasant situation. Both are by the sea, where the air is very, very wet. And if you suffer from any lung issues, you'd be better to find a place up in the higher parts of town where the air was more dry. And Hollister really took this to heart and decided on building his hotel on the northern part of State Street. The hotel is a 3-story establishment with 90 rooms. It was in an L-shaped construction, and it had a bed capacity of 150, and each room actually had its own fireplace. And it was quite luxurious. Let's see, what's this guy going? The building, the Arlington at the time, cost $170,000 to manufacture in 1876, and it was a favorite creation of Santa Barbara. The elevated site at State and Sola was chosen. The furnishings were left to the women of the stockholders. Mrs. Hollister, she took a steamer up to San Francisco, and she had a $30,000 budget. She spent every dime, and the furnishings they got were quite elegant. Yeah. After the hotel was furnished and opened, everyone was overjoyed. But it's actually easier to build a hotel than it is to run one. And initially, the hotel was a paying out business, which you would assume, and then after a few months, you would assume that you would start to make a profit. But this didn't happen, and it was due to poor management. The stockholders were really not engaged as well as they should be, and they actually ended up just relinquishing everything over to Mr. Hollister, and he would soon become the sole proprietor of what was called his White Elephant. So, as the stockholders knew that they were in desperate need of proper management for the hotel, and they suggested to go out to New York and recruit some dignified, lofty individual from a hotel in New York. Hollister balked at this idea because he knew of somebody of special talent, and the hotel business requires a man of rare and unique talent. Colonel Hollister knew of one man that contained this unique talent, and that was Dixie Thompson. So in late November of 1879, Dixie Thompson would become the sole manager of the Arlington Hotel. He was an instant success, and the hotel quickly became a profitable business. And Dixie's whole life had been passed in much rougher places than being the manager of a hotel. But he certainly...
So what sticks out that made him an instant success?
So what it was he had none of the qualities you would desire in a regular hotel manager. He wasn't arrogant, he wasn't lofty, he wasn't dignified, but he had one quality that everybody appreciated, and that was approachability. And so Dixie learned many secrets about running a hotel, but the one phrase that really sums it all up was make your guests comfortable. Dixie did that, and the hotel was the most successful hotel in the region at the time. So while landlord of the Arlington, he was a very popular individual, and in the 1880s there were no railways in the area, and steamships only came at certain days, so you had to find amusement, and it was hard to find amusement in a dull, small little town of Santa Barbara at the time. But Captain Thompson could organize a series of specialties that were new and interesting to people that would come from the East Coast, such as Boston and New York. He would take people on free rides and carriages up to the great ranches of Santa Barbara. He would have picnics for them, and they would tour them through the wonderful canyons of Santa Barbara and all the beautiful nature around them. He also had Spanish dances in the royal parlors of the Arlington, and he put on fine feats of horsemanship by various California riders. And at the hotel grounds, they had soft music, violins and guitars, with vaqueros performing all these wonderful horseman-type tricks throughout the grounds. So, in 1882, I think keeps doing that. Princess Louise, she was the daughter of Queen Victoria. She was on a United States tour, and around Christmas time they ended up in Santa Barbara. And her husband stayed at the Arlington. They had actually taken 6 suites and kind of combined them into one big room. However they did that, I'm not sure, but they had decorated the place up with gold leafing throughout the building just to make it extremely, extremely opulent for these the royalty that were visiting. As I said, Dixie and his fellow friends were riding around all the time on their horses, showing off their vaquero skills. And Princess Louise happened to see Dixie on a saddle, came up and spoke with him, and she really enjoyed what the saddle looked like and appreciated all the leather work and wanted to know who the maker was. So Dixie took her down the street, which was about 8 blocks down to Ortega Street, where the S. Loomis saddlery and harness shop was. She introduced them to Sherman, and she was so taken by the artwork on the saddles that she wanted something of her own. She didn't ride horses, so she didn't want a saddle. So she asked Sherman to make a portfolio for her out of a leather-tooled portfolio with flowering designs and all this. And she was just struck by it, how wonderfully beautiful it was. She ordered multiple portfolios and lots of ladies' belts that were engraved with leather tooling. This was the first instance that leather tooling was applied to something other than the saddle, and so this spurred a whole new industry of merchandise, being leather tooling on picture frames, various menus, tablecloths, or table mats, sorry. Some of the other things being magazine covers and other such goods as that. I thought that was fascinating myself.
Now, where was Princess Louise from?
She was the daughter of Queen Victoria in England, so her and her husband and her son came over in early 1881. They spent over a year in the United States touring around, and she was actually the first woman to ever get to go in the back of the Mission. There's apparently a very secluded place back there where you can see various fathers interned and whatnot, so she was the first woman to get back there. That's fascinating. Captain Thompson's popular reputation extended throughout the state and far beyond its boundaries, not only as a man of affairs, but as a pioneer of California. Marked trait of his private life was his open-hearted generosity, and he never failed to lend aid to those in need. Businessmen that were in times of depression, he would give work to, often if he didn't even make a profit off them. So he was truly a generous and kind man. This is our first image that we see in history of Dixie and his saddle. This was taken in 1890. This is his horse Canute, and that's Dixie Thompson. I'll now get into the
Does
saddle.
that saddle still survive?
That saddle still survives. I'm going to highlight that saddle now. I'm going to talk about how it was made, who made it, and where it is today. The S. Loomis shop, as I mentioned, was located on State Street. It was between Ortega and De La Guerra Streets. Sherman had moved from Pennsylvania to Monterey in 1863. A year later, came down to Santa Barbara and opened his saddle shop. He employed his entire family in the shop. His son's Al. He had a son also named Dixie. Don't know if it's related in any way, but it happened. Ira and Seth were two of his other sons that were very talented in leather tooling. I brought today a saddle that was made by the S. Loomis Company in the 1890s. This saddle was housed at the Tecolote Ranch. It was purchased by Silsby Spalding, who was the first mayor of Beverly Hills. I'm not sure if the saddle was ever rode that much because of it's just in impeccable condition. It has the original wool. It has everything is original to the saddle. And after the talk, you guys feel free to come up and take a look at it, touch it, and enjoy it. Here's two other examples of Loomis saddles that we have at our museum in Santa Barbara. And you can, of course, you can see the beautiful workmanship, the leather tooling. The saddles, not being just very beautiful works of art, they were actually extremely, extremely good working saddles. They were very comfortable and very practical. So people that purchased a Loomis saddle usually rode the heck out of them. And so you don't see many examples remaining today. So we're very fortunate to have a few of these saddles in our collection.
Was this like the top level of saddle?
Yeah,
Like
it
they
was
had the wall
top of the
line,
line for sure.
everybody else?
Yeah, if you had one, you were somebody.
What is that metal on the saddle?
This is all silver working. I'm going to get into little details all
You'll
around
get
it
into
in a
the
second.
price they paid. No.
Oh yeah, exactly. So the S. Loomis Company, as I said, they were the ones that actually made the saddle itself, the wood skeleton and all the leathering on the outside. And that was done by a fellow by the name of Jose Mesa, along with Ira Loomis. They were the two involved in making the saddle. One thing I forgot to say was Dixie noticed that old California was quickly giving away to new California, which I'm sure every generation is always saying and thinking. But he thought to himself he needed to save or make something to represent just what he called barbaric splendor of old California, and that being the ostentatious, just ridiculous adornment of these saddles with silver.
Yes.
And so,
Who actually did the, I want to say engraving?
all the silver work was done by a fellow by the name of John Chester Fields, and I'm going to get into that in just a second. So, no, that's fine. The saddle is typical Mexican artwork. It's got a high pommel, a high back seat, and a well hollowed out seat. It's made of entirely Mexican leather. The stamping was done, as I said, by Al Loomis. Al and Ira Loomis were the two that did all the stamping. The saddle itself was made by Jose Mesa, which was he was employed by the S. Loomis Company. In 1889, I said Seth and Ira were making the saddle because Sherman had passed away in 1886. And Sherman was a very, very good friend of Dixie's, and Dixie actually was one of the pallbearers in his funeral. And so Dixie had several saddles made by the Loomis Company. They've all disappeared, and only one now remains, which is the saddle we see here. John Chester Fields was the son of Tiffany-trained Edwin Fields, and he made all the silver work that adorned the saddle. He encased the pommel, which is this portion here, and the cantil back here. You can see are just completely encased with all this silver work. And yeah, the silver buttons.
They didn't use them to ride, right?
Yeah, he rode this saddle. He
Poor horse.
yeah,
Must
it
have
did.
been time.
Yeah, it did. I don't know how much it weighs exactly. I do have some numbers on the bridle and other portions of it, but all the silver was done by the Fields family, and it was every piece of silver on the saddles was made from a Mexican silver dollar. So Dixie collected Mexican silver dollars for years and years and years, and as he got them, he would give them to Edwin or John, and they would stamp out these coins and stick them to the saddle. It took over 2 years to just make the silver work on the saddle. And you can see it's just completely adorned. The Mexican silver coins contain less alloy than American silver dollars at the time, so they were much easier to work with. And so exclusively Mexican silver pesos were used on the saddle. John Fields was a perfectionist, and he felt that traditionally engraved saddles lacked a lot of trimming, or the trimmings lacked a lot of artwork or any visual presence. So he began stamping designs into the rosettes. And he used often flower arrangements that his wife or his mother had picked out and put together for him. And he did all this in a Mexican-style silver stamping, but using dyes and whatnot. As you can see, it's entirely handcrafted. There's an enormous amount of man hours and labor, but the result was completely justified by the time spent on this saddle. You can see that as I said, the cantil, the stirrups, the pommel are all highly encased with silver, weighing a lot. They had attached rings on the back, which were used by vaqueros for various tricks and whatnot. Some ornaments you can see are wheat heads. Oops. Yeah, there's animals, wheat heads, flowers, all kinds of different ornamentation throughout the saddle. So, gosh, where's this thing going? There we go. So the silver stranded reins were made by an individual called, his name was Celestino Trujillo. He was up in Monterey, and he was a friend of Sherman's, and I don't know if Dixie knew him personally. I know he knew Sherman well, and I'm assuming Sherman had suggested that Dixie recruit Celestino to make the reins for him. These reins are just kind of ridiculous. The bridle was covered with fluted. Celestino, like I said, he worked in Monterey. He was a well-known jewelsmith. He worked with gold, silver, and abalone. And the bridle was covered with fluted silver. The brow band and nose piece, all of it was just finely engraved. The massive head plate was on the top here. You can kind of see up in here. Had these two plates on them, and in scroll work, it's hard to read now, but it reads Dixie W. Thompson, Santa Barbara 88, and I'm assuming that just over time there's been some tarnishing and it makes it hard to read. Nothing but silver enters into this construction of the reins, the throat lash, the collar, and all of it. What he did is he took the Mexican silver dollars, hammered them into fine wire, and he actually crocheted them together to make these pieces. And he would put links on each side, and then with a cap, and then another piece. And you can see here, I've brought it up a little closer. This is the whip, and or the headstall here, and this is the bridle here. This is the bit, and then these are the reins that would just dangle down. And I don't even know how anybody could do this, but it's just marvelous. And I wish I had got to see it in person at one time. So here we go with Jose Mardueño and Vicente Mardueño were Ventura individuals. He made bits here in Ventura. They had a shop on Main Street. And they also owned a ranch at Seacliff, which is now called Mardueño Canyon. The Mardueño family were the best of the best when it came to making a bit. He has examples in the Smithsonian Institute today. The bit made for Dixie Thompson saddle, again, was made from silver dollars. They took over 250 silver dollars, melted down and forged into making the bit that you see here in the classic Santa Barbara style. So I'll sum it up a little bit. Here is Dixie's entire montadura. Montadura is Spanish for the entire outfit or the kit that he used. That includes the saddle, the bridle, the reins, the headstall, every piece of it. You can see here. The bridle comes down. These are the reins that are made by Celestino, and as I said, fine woven, crocheted silver. The saddle by Loomis, the silver work by the Fields family, and the bit by Mordueni. So 4 individual shops came together to make this spectacular saddle for Dixie. And as I said, I think he made this so he could somehow preserve, the style of saddle from Mexican culture. This is his horse, Canute. This is a picture of his horse when it was approximately 2 years old. He raised horses here in town. He had many friends that had stables, one being Sam Stanwood, who was El Presidente of the Santa Barbara Fiesta for 20 years, in the 20s to the 40s. Sam was also Dixie's protege, and he worked at the Arlington, kind of following Dixie around, cleaning up and doing whatnot. Canute, like I said, is one of Dixie's favorite horses. It was named after an 11th century Danish king, which kind of shows that Dixie was an educated individual. So Dixie's...
So Canute is a Danish word?
I believe so, yeah, that's what I found on the internet. Canute, I assume that's how you pronounce it.
Canute.
Canute, yeah, that's fair too.
Canute Rotten.
Oh, there you go.
So did he ever ride that in a parade or anything?
There was a question about did he ever ride in parades?
Oh, yeah. This is a picture.
He went back east, right?
Yeah, he did something back east. Yeah, we'll get into that in a few minutes. This is a picture of Dixie and his horse, again, with the whole entire saddle. The first time he displayed the saddle to the public was in September 9th of 1890 at the Admissions Day Parade for the Native Sons of California. The saddle took over 2 years to complete. Was significant oversight by Dixie. As I said, he was constantly coming in, bringing more coins for Fields' family to hammer out. And like I said, Dixie was in the parade. The city was just wowed by Dixie. This is his first showing of his saddle, and there's tons of news articles just blathering about how wonderful his saddle is. So he traveled up and down the coast for over 10 years parading his saddle in parades in San Diego, San Francisco, Los Angeles. You name it, if there was a parade and Dixie was invited, he was sure to be there to show off his saddle and many of his horses. This is a different horse of his. This is Tecumseh, which is a Shawnee word for warrior chief. You can tell it's a different horse because Canute has only, he has a sock. You can see the white sock here. He has a single white sock, and Tecumseh has no socks, as you can see there. So this is one of the things I've noticed throughout. So he often rode these horses in parades, and anytime he was invited, he was sure to show up, and he was an earnest request.
So how would you get from Santa Barbara to San Diego?
So he would often take steamers up and down. Orizaba was one that was constantly going between San Diego and San Francisco, often stopping in Santa Barbara.
Taking a horse and carriage would be...
Yeah, it would be ridiculous, yeah, and it would take weeks probably. I knew it'd take, in 1890, riding a carriage from the Arlington to the top of San Marcos Pass would take about 8 hours. So you can see it's probably what it takes us 15 minutes now. Yes.
We've had a lot of rain. We set a record again this year. And I'm remembering Ronald Reagan when asked about pollution, when pollution was a really big thing before they started to do something about it, especially in LA. And he said, well, suppose all those horses were cars. It occurs to me, in a season like we've had, was it the city or who were doing the cleanup, following those horses around?
Right.
They were a heck of a lot. I mean, all your photographs are nice, clean, pretty looking, but
Yep.
that's not reality for me.
Not at all.
But it's
Not at all.
funny too, because you can see a bike right there, so
Yeah.
you're entering an era where now bikes are competing with horses.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny because Dixie Thompson was actually the first man to ride a bike in Santa Barbara. There's a nice article about him. And I'm not sure the exact date, but he rode that bicycle up State Street and people would stand there with mouths agape. What the heck is this guy on, you know? Because everybody's, of course, used to carriages and horses and commonplace. But,
Who was paid to do the cleanup?
I couldn't tell you.
You don't have any history on
I
that?
know. I never really thought about
I've
it.
never heard
It was
that.
a union job.
But at least.
A union job.
Public service.
Are his horses buried in any special places, or is there any designation for where his horse is made and buried?
I don't know that. That's a great question. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Yeah, that's a great question.
The other question I have is, where would we send our children today to learn the craft? Like, you've been explaining it, beautiful. I mean, it takes some teaching
Oh,
to
yeah.
do that.
Yeah, just even blacksmithing itself is a lost art nowadays. It's a tragedy, if you ask me. I really am fascinated by the old artisan techniques. You know, just hammering out silver. Who does this anymore? Everybody, you know, they got these 3D printers and all these things nowadays. Lost arts, for sure. And I wish, you know, only being with the museum for 8 months, I've had, you know, delusions of grandeur, of course. And I
There
was,
aren't any trade schools today to send a kid to learn how to do
I
that?
know there has to be, because I know that.
Yes. I taught metal and jewelry, was my minor, at the junior college occasionally, metal and jewelry, and we would ascribe to that, yes.
How to create it?
How to work with silver specifically.
Yeah, now you mentioned that.
Silver soldering and et cetera, at a junior college.
Yeah, in high school, I actually took an art class where I made a necklace out of
Yes,
metal myself.
Sometimes,
Yeah,
some high schools would do that.
yeah, and that was at Santa Barbara High
You
School.
were very lucky.
And I don't know where that necklace went. I wish I still had it.
Um,
But yeah, these are lost arts, and I know a lot of the newer generation is starting to revert back to older ways. I know there's a lot of like artisan butchery shops opening up nowadays. Cheeses are getting to be more and more popular to make in the old-fashioned ways, and you know, everything comes full circle. But I know there's probably a lot of lost art. You know, people have passed away, and the little secrets they took to the grave with them, which is, you know, unfortunate, but pretty common, I would assume. Yeah. And so Dixie and his saddle, he made many alterations over the years to his saddle. It was an ongoing project for him. And you can see here's 3 pictures of his saddle, and you can see the differences in it. And I'll highlight those in the next slide here. You can see the fender art had changed significantly over his lifespan. This first image here, you can see there's no silver adornment, where you have a sickle or a piece of wheat, I believe, and then it ended up with a flower surrounded by leaves. And this is what resides on the saddle today. And that was one clear modification that I was able to see
So would he like
through the
go
research.
through stages and go, hey, you know what?
I assume so, yeah. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
That could be it too, yeah. It's kind of, again, lost information. And I just kind of noticed it as I was going through and looking at the pictures. These all pictures, you know, from early 1900s, late 1890s. I'm pleasantly surprised that a lot of them remain, or there is that many of him. As photography, I believe, came about in the 1830s, I think, 1840s, somewhere around there. So Dixie was a staple in all of our floral festivals and parades throughout California. This image is from a floral festival here in up in Santa Barbara in 1890. I believe this was 1891, and this is when former President Harrison visited Southern California, and we held the first floral festival was held for President Harrison, and Dixie was the Grand Marshal and the main attraction in the parade. He led the parade, followed by dozens of riders dressed in Mexican vaquero gear. And he was quite the spectacle during these parades, as he would ride backwards on his horse where everybody else would ride forward. riding sideways, doing circles, all kinds of exciting vaquero tricks on Tecumseh, his favorite horse. Early 1893, Dixie made his way to Chicago. He actually took his horse with him to display his saddle at the Chicago World's Fair. It was called the Columbus Exposition, or the Columbian Exposition, which was to highlight the 400th anniversary of Columbus discovering the New World. So he actually took a Pullman car with other Santa Barbarans up to Chicago, stopping at Denver and Utah on the way. Took his horse with him, and he was in the admissions parade for the first day of the festival of the fair. He displayed his saddle in the California Pavilion that was made specially for the fair, and it was in the Gold Rush era display to show a saddle from around the Gold Rush era.
It's not in that.
Yeah, that's him. He just has his head turned. I don't know why they took it that way.
What's that captain say? $4,000?
Yeah, so his saddle at the time in 1893 was appraised at around $4,000, and that was, I read that in a story in a paper called The Argonaut, and it talked about his saddle in quite the splendor, and coined it to be approximately $400,000 then. With inflation and conversion, today $4,000 in 1893 would be about $117,000 today. So he's riding around on a Lamborghini, essentially.
One horsepower.
Right? So here's a cool little picture I found in a San Francisco newspaper. It's a drawing of Canute on with the Dixie saddle. This was an article in May of 1896, where Dixie headed up there to be in the flower parade that they were holding. He was basically put on show in front of the Palace Hotel every day while he was up there, and it drew crowds of people. They would all come up and stand around his horse. You can see people touching it and just admiring the saddle for its craftsmanship. So, also, in 1901, May 10th, President McKinley, he was the first active president to visit California, and Santa Barbara held a floral parade in his honor as well. And again, Dixie, the Grand Marshal, put on a spectacular display of vaquero arts, again prancing up and down the street, riding at full speed, and people would throw coins on the ground, and he would run by him at full speed, and he would hang to the side and pick the coins up off the ground, riding on his saddle. And this trick was called colgar, or meaning to hang. And so he was hanging off the side of his saddle, and it's remarkable. I think it's just fantastic. And so him prancing up and down the street. I don't know if you guys have been to a fiesta parade or anything like that, but you'll see these charro horses that have their little, feet picking up like that. And so he would do that type of riding, and people were just awed by it because it was something new and different that nobody had seen before. So this again, Dixie on Tecumseh in the 1901 floral parade here in Santa Barbara.
He's looking at the cameras.
Yeah, he's got the camera this side. Yeah. So funnily enough, like I said, he would ride his horse up and down the street full speed, picking up coins off the ground. And he actually had this picture. He would kind of take this after the parade was done, and he got a hold of the picture of himself and his horse. He would take the picture around with him and show people how spectacular it was, probably because there wasn't a lot of pictures, and he was just so proud of it. I can imagine him going, "Hey, look at my horse."
When I was a kid, the circus riders would do something like that.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That's fascinating. This is great. So,
Wow.
yeah. So, here's another picture of Dixie's horse. So this is an article from the Santa Barbara, that was called the Daily Press at the time. In 1902, Dixie was to appear on the grounds of the Arlington Hotel to show off his saddle in a benefit for Cottage Hospital. Cottage Hospital was actually a cottage originally. It was made by a group of women to help sick people get better. And I don't know a ton of history about Cottage Hospital, but I know that Dixie at the time was about 76 years old, and he kept his saddle in a local bank vault, And for him to get the saddle out was quite an ordeal. Him being 76, he wasn't in the best of health. He agreed to bring his saddle out, and this would be the final showing of the saddle to the public in 1902. This was in April. As I said, this was a benefit for Cottage Hospital. And Dixie believed that these women were doing a great service to the town. And so also that same month, he was invited to go to a fiesta in Los Angeles to display a saddle, but him being in poor health, he declined, although the invitation included many personalized cards from just public citizens telling Dixie how much they loved the saddle and would love to see it one more time. And so, unfortunately, in April 1903, Dixie passed away at the age of 77 years old. He passed away at his house on Chapala Street with Nancy by his side. He was ill for several months with the flu, and it eventually claimed him. He had a large procession in Santa Barbara with many, many famous individuals and alongside his casket. He's interned in the Montecito Cemetery, and you can see his gravestone today. So I'll talk a little bit about where the saddle is today and why I don't have it sitting next to me now. Miss Thompson, like I said, passed away in 1926, but right upon Dixie's passing, she donated the entire montadura, which comprises the bridle, the reins, all of the pieces of the saddle, along with the sombrero that you saw in the previous picture, to the M.H.D. Young Museum in San Francisco. That museum was established in 1895, and in 1903 there was no museum in Santa Barbara, or I'm sure it would have been donated to the Santa Barbara Museum. But unfortunately, one didn't exist, and so this was the next best thing, being that he also had family living in San Francisco due to his mother and father moving there later in their life. The provenance of the saddle is such that the D. Young Museum loaned it to the Pioneer Museum in California, where they displayed it for decades in a Gold Rush era display, as it was in the World's Fair in Chicago.
Where was the Pioneer Museum?
It was near, as far as I understand, it was near the D. Young Museum, so it was in San Francisco. How close it was, I'm not 100% sure. But after it was loaned to the Pioneer, the D. Young Museum got the saddle back, and Gledhill, who ran the Santa Barbara Historical Society in the 70s, contacted the D. Young Museum and requested that the saddle be brought to Santa Barbara to be put on display because of its Santa Barbara history, the significance of it. It was made here. Everybody involved in making the saddle was from here. And so they agreed, and the saddle was on display here in Santa Barbara until about 2009, when the D. Young Museum requested the saddle back. Apparently there was a lot of paperwork involved, and it was a little difficult for them to get the saddle back. But like I said, in 2009, the saddle went back to San Francisco and sat at the D. Young Museum on display. My dad, Tom Peterson, he is the curator of the Carriage and Western Art Museum, and he's been with the museum since 1995. And in 2012, he called the D. Young Museum and asked if we could have the saddle on loan to the Carriage Museum because of its Santa Barbara significance. And we're a Carriage Museum, we have tons of saddles on display, so it would be a perfect fit. She wasn't really into the idea, so she refused to let us have the saddle on display. And my dad, he's an insurance salesman by trade, was sitting in his office in April of 2015, and he got an auction book from the Brian LaBelle auction, and on the cover was Dixie's saddle. And so in June, the saddle went up for auction in Texas. My dad was able to raise $160,000 to bid on the saddle, but an oil tycoon that lived in Texas never put his paddle down. He just sat with his paddle up until we ran out of money. He ended up paying nearly $200,000 for the saddle, and unfortunately the saddle now sits in somebody's living room and nobody gets to see it but one person. So it's a sad thing, and working only for about 8 months with the museum, I have a mission, and it would be my life goal, and it would be very, very satisfying if I could actually get the saddle to our museum, even on loan, just before my dad passes.
Did you talk to the guy?
No, his name is McAdoo, as far as we know. That was his handle
That's all you
on
get.
auction. We have a friend of the museum. His name is Griff Durham, and he's actually been in contact with that fellow, and he's actually asked him to loan the saddle to us. He knew nothing about Dixie Thompson, so Griff, being the kind man that he is, sent him tons of literature on Dixie, so he knows now a little bit of history about the saddle. And so we have been in contact with him. He's refused all of our attempts to get the saddle up here back to Santa Barbara.
Maybe you could charm him, like.
I'm here now, so maybe, we'll see.
Put the old Dixie Thompson charm on.
Yeah, I'm gonna give a talk, gonna tell them the history of it all. And so it's a sad ending to it. You kind of build up thinking, oh, and we have to settle now, but no, we don't.
What city is it in now?
It's in Texas, I believe it's El Paso. Yeah, and I don't know. Brian Lapel, he runs the Old West auction company or auction house, and I know that they have auctions throughout the country, and it happened to be in Texas that year, and I wonder if maybe it was in Arizona or somewhere else, maybe we could have had a better chance at it. It's unfortunate, but that's part of life. As I said, I'm the assistant curator at the Santa Barbara Carriage and Art Museum. We're located on 129 Castillo Street in Santa Barbara. We're open Monday through Friday from 9 to 3. We have an extensive collection of historic saddles by historic saddle makers from Santa Barbara, some being J.M. Forbes, Jedlicas, Visalia Saddlery, and Loomis Saddlery. We have examples of all such saddles. And I'd love you guys to come up and check out our saddle collection, bridle collection, and we have a very large carriage collection as well.
Do you have a website?
We do have a website, carriagemuseum.org. And we're a nonprofit entity. We have one paid employee. His name's Alex, and he's basically our maintenance handyman, leather guy. So feel free to come on up and check out what a real Loomis saddle is like.
Okay, so apparently Dixie Thompson never lived in Ventura.
He did. I don't know, actually. I know he owned the Rancho San Miguel. I'm not sure if he ever had a home here, but he probably lived on the ranch, I would guess, but I don't know 100%. Yeah.
You spent quite a bit of time talking about silver, and that was the only metal that I ordered when I taught metal and jewelry.
Really?
Silver is a pure element, and it was actually used as an antibiotic before
Yes.
antibiotics.
Yeah, they did copper as well.
Yes, no, silver,
also-
not copper.
Oh, is that right?
There's
Yeah.
also
Only silver.
silver-infused cloths you could get now for wiping down counters.
Oh, really? As an antimicrobial?
Gadget, the
Yes.
microbial, yeah.
That's fascinating.
I
Yeah.
buy it, and I buy it in a bottle, and you can use it as an antibiotic.
Really? That's fascinating.
And nothing, no germs, nothing can live in
Yeah,
it.
yeah, of course, yeah.
A pure element.
That's fantastic.
Dylan, thank you so much.
Oh, it's
Very
my pleasure.
fascinating. Larry has a couple things for you, but I also do want to say, I might be on my own here, but I would love to hear you talk about your research in Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah.
I know it affects some of us in this area, and
Yeah, it's funny.
maybe we can get you back on that.
Yeah, it's funny because putting this talk together, I've never given a history style talk before, so it's very different. Yeah, and I thought, I wish I could just be giving a science talk because I could, put some data on there and I could blabber around about Alzheimer's forever.
Well,
So.
maybe we could we'll work with Larry on that. Larry's got a gift for you.
Oh, great! Thank you.
Here you go.
Oh, wonderful.
You speaking here.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Certificate for you.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And then we also have, these are DVDs of the history of the area.
Oh, great.
And this is the history of Hueneme.
Uh-huh.
And then the other ones are by
Wonderful.
pioneers that lived here.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
And we're going to pass
My
that
pleasure.
on.
Need to,
Thank you.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah. No problem.
we usually pass the hat donation.
I also brought a stack of newsletters from our museum. The first article in there is actually about the floral parades in Santa Barbara. There's a stack, you can grab one on the way out, and we put out a newsletter every quarter. So come by the Carriage Museum, you can get a newsletter and check out our collection.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming, guys. I appreciate it.
Very, very good.